Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland once again. So this is a further video about pro-gun arguments. So trying to examine those and deal with them one by one. So thank you very much for your comments. Often they've been courteous, and it could be that I'm dead wrong on this issue, and I welcome reproof. So we can discuss this in a civilized manner. So let me go through the major pro-gun arguments. Not that I'm anti-gun, I just think that there should be greater limitations on gun rights. One of these is it's in the Constitution. We have gun rights because it's in the Constitution. Seems to me this puts the cart before the horse. Surely you should think it's in the Constitution because it's right, not that it's right because it's in the Constitution. If you see the difference, I hope you can distinguish the difference between the two. We're trying to see the difference between cause and effect. We put things that are essential into the Constitution. The fact they're in the Constitution doesn't of itself make it right. Permissive liberty, that's another pro-gun argument. So in the United States, as in most Anglophone countries, one starts the assumption that something is permitted unless it's specifically forbidden, all right? So I would go on to say that we do regulate dangerous items. Everybody agrees that dangerous items need to be regulated. The debate then is, how dangerous does something need to be regulated? Everything's a little bit dangerous, and how regulated should it be, right up to the point of something being forbidden. So it's really a question of degree. It's not something which is absolutely either way. Okay, another major pro-gun argument is that it prevents tyranny, and that you would always be able to rebel against the government if they mistreated you. Well, I can debunk this straight away, really. So 1791, that Second Amendment came out. Let's look at some rebellions against the US government since then. Well, in no particular order, there was Dawes Rebellion in 1841 in Rhode Island, obviously using small arms, that was defeated. Or Freeze Rebellion in 1799 in Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebellion. Before that, the year of the Second Amendment. Not actually quite sure if it's just before the Second Amendment or not. So rebellions have certainly failed. You're telling me that possession of arms would prevent tyranny. So African Americans weren't tyrannized for 80 years after independence. The Constitution didn't forbid African Americans, including slaves, from having guns. Occasionally, slaveholders would even give their slaves guns to provide security for the slaveholders. So it's nonsensical to suggest that gun rights are going to guarantee there won't be tyranny. Let's look at the biggest rebellion of all, the Confederates. They called themselves rebels. Now remind me, who won the Civil War? Was it the US government or was it the Confederacy? I know the Confederacy was fighting for tyranny, but it was claimed they were against tyranny. Is there no end to your bloodlust, you gun rights enthusiasts, that you can have rebellion all the time and that's the way to settle differences? Let me see. Do you want guns in the hand of communist revolutionaries? And how about guns in civilian hands? These can be used to tyrannize people. The Ku Klux Klan, they used guns as part of their campaign of oppressing African Americans well into the 1960s. They would have kidnapped them at gunpoint before these unfortunate people were murdered in public lynchings. So when the US military was in Iraq and Afghanistan, the first thing the US military did was to confiscate firearms from ordinary Iraqis and Afghans. And I've made this point, and none of the comments have come back on this. So I suppose this must be an unanswerable argument that I'm making here. So would you say that Saddam was not a tyrant because he permitted people to have even semi-automatics? And was the action of the US military tyrannical? I think here you're being hoisted on your own petard on the way you think that gun rights are so sacrosanct and so important and so essential to liberty. It's proved to be a preposterous argument. Another pro-gun argument is the claim that it reduces crime. So how do we know who's going to be a criminal? An ordinary person can then go on to commit a crime, and you've enabled them if you've permitted them to have a very powerful weapon. Another thing is a gun raises the stakes. So where I'm from, civilians don't have guns, and the mugger will obviously assume you don't, and then therefore he or she is very unlikely to kill you or indeed wound you. But if he or she believes you do have a gun, then they're going to kill you because they're going to kill you before you kill them. So it turns something which would be deeply unpleasant into something which is deadly. And no, it's not victim blaming, it is always the criminal's fault. So one of my interlocutors in these little discussions was saying, oh, but they had very destructive firearms when the Second Amendment came out. I remember in Massachusetts in a museum there seeing an organ of death, as I think Longfellow described it, as in about 20 muskets on some sort of wagon that was to be hand pushed, and they could all be fired at one point with a pin, take ages to reload them. Maybe that's what he was talking about. Well, issues are very often on a authoritarian, libertarian axis. We've got to decide what's more important, choice or safety. That's really it. And there's a ratchet. We can slide it this way or we can slide it that way. Bearing in mind, we can never have absolute security or never have absolute liberty. There's some logical fallacies which come into this debate. The absolutist fallacy. One doesn't have to follow logic to its intellectual vanishing point. One can be somewhere along the scale. There are infinite gradations in between the two extreme positions. Just I tend to be more in the authoritarian direction than many people who call themselves gun advocates. So some gun advocates would say that the founding fathers, they envisaged weapons of infinite lethality being invented. So I wonder if that applies all the way up to and including nuclear bombs. So unlimited destructive capacity. And nobody has had any rejoinder on this by saying, would you permit a billionaire to have his own nuclear bomb for home defense because some billionaires could afford it? And nobody said no to that. If they did, then they would be fatally undermining their argument that this notion that the right to carry weapons is endlessly extendable. So then pro-gun advocates come and say, why would you restrict people having firearms? You can kill with knives. You can ban those. You can kill with hammers and so on. It's true you can kill with those, so in practice people very seldom do, even in countries where guns are rather more restricted in the United States. People don't kill with knives and hammers so much. At least with a knife and a hammer, the person, the kill has to be within arm's length of the victim. The victim has a good chance to run away or indeed to disarm the would-be killer. All right, people can throw knives, but not that far. So one of the reasons I believe guns should be severely restricted is partly the range, as well as the fact that they can fire so many shots before needing to be reloaded. And gun advocates say you could kill with your bare hands. Are we going to take away people's hands? That really is reductio ad absurdum. And again, it's a false comparison. Are you born with guns? They're not attached to the human body. They're manufactured by us. They're created for a purpose. That's of killing people. In fairness, they could be used to kill animals. As for automatic weapons, there's really no sport in firing dozens of shots against an animal. It doesn't require much skill. And this is another one. I wonder when this would come out. Some of the extreme pro-gun people say, using the argumentum ad Hitlerum, you know that someone's being irrational as soon as they mention the Third Reich as an example in their favour, and saying, well, if it wasn't for that, the right to bear arms, we could have tyranny here, and because they didn't have the right to carry guns in Germany, that's why I ended up with the Third Reich, which is preposterous because gun rights were quite extensive in Germany in the 1930s. Many private citizens owned guns. The uncomfortable fact is National Socialism was fairly popular there, had almost a majority of the vote. So people voted for these terrible policies, and this tyrant came in. I know he demolished their liberty and their constitution piecemeal. There were hunting rifles in the USSR in the worst era of Stalin, not in huge numbers. Or in China, the communists, they started out as a rebellion, and then they had Mao's genocide. So guns in civilian hands, was that a good thing in China, bringing the communists to power? I'm not sure it could have been successfully resisted. As I say, there have been so many insurrections that have failed. Anyway, the US is unique in emphasizing gun rights so much. 193 sovereign states in the world, only one of them puts guns as a right in the Constitution. When only one country has something in law and all the others don't, you think who's likely to be right? I know wisdom isn't always democratic, but who's likely to be right? You know, till 1990, only one country in the world outlawed marriages between black people and white people. So who was more likely to be right there? Or until this year, only one country in the world forbade women from driving. So who was more likely to be right, the one country or all the rest? Or let me see, in the early 60s, Saudi Arabia abolished slavery, the last country to allow it. Who was more likely to be right, the one country or all the rest? Until a few years ago, only one country in the world had now outlawed the execution of children. Who was more likely to be right, the one or the 192? And by the way, that was the United States, the last country to outlaw it. So it could be that I'm mistaken. I try not to valorize my own country, have this foolish presupposition that because it's done this way in my country, it must be right. And some of the gun advocates are taking that view. So this psychological conditioning, people always want to think that their way is the best way, but try and step back. Try not to be so emotional about it, not to invest your self-esteem in believing that your country has it right. Now, in the Republic of Ireland, we have gun rights, only they're more limited than in the United States. So I suppose we don't have what we don't miss, and it hasn't brought around tyranny in almost 100 years of independence, and it hasn't brought a particularly high crime rate, especially a high murder rate compared to the United States. So please, I want to hear your comments. I welcome admonition. I've got an open mind. Perhaps I'm wrong, and I want to hear about it. Thank you.